Okay. Good morning, everyone. And if I can encourage you to take a seat as soon as you can. So we are about to start. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tiffany Chu. I am a Principal Teaching Fellows at the Center for Higher Education Research and Scholarship. And as part of the organizing committees, I warmly welcome you to join this conference on advancing feedback practice with generative AI, pedagogical challenges and opportunities. It's so nice to see many of you here, despite the tube strikes, and I hope the way in was okay for you. But this shows the huge commitment to today's event. Before we officially begin, I just need to run through a few housekeeping notices. So the first one is there are no planned fire alarms today. So if the fire alarms does go off, please follow the signs and use the nearest exit, the fire exit. The event program is available online, so you can download it. I think it will be handy. So after the keynote panel sessions, we will have the parallel sessions taking place in different rooms. For today's event, there will be 3 rooms in action. So you are very likely to travel from one room to another, but we will have signs throughout the venues to help direct you. For external colleagues, warm welcome to Imperial. If you are unsure where to go, please do ask people around you. So there is a very good chance they are from Imperials and will be able to help. Okay. Another point I want to make is that we have a professional photographer with us today. So if you prefer not to appear in any photographs, please let myself, Sherry, and the photographer know, and we will take it from there. Okay. Yeah, the photographer is here. Okay, and yeah, I think that is about everything. And if you have any questions, please feel free to approach any of us near the registration desk. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Ellen Spivey to our Vice Provost for Education and Student Experience to open the event. Ellen, over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to Imperial. It's a huge honor for me to be here today to introduce this conference. I'm not going to repeat the title of the conference. We know why we're here. I can see many people that I know in the audience from Imperial, but I can see a lot of people that I don't know come from other institutions, London and beyond. So welcome to you as well. And as I will explain, and I think you all know, this challenge of education when students, staff, everyone is using generative AI tools is a challenge and an opportunity that is shared right across the sector. Imperial is not going to solve it on its own. It's going to need to work with partners, with students, etc. So it's great to have representation from students, from staff, and from colleagues across the sector. And I would also particularly like to thank the team behind today's conference before I forget, particularly colleagues at the Center for Higher Education Research and Scholarship, as we call it, CHERS, and particularly Tiffany Chu and everyone involved in the FLAIR project for bringing together what I hope will be a thought-provoking conference. Okay, so we know that in Q1 2023, ChatGPT launched 3.5, and since then the world has kind of changed. Everyone, bar a few, are using these tools and related foundational tools, but also specialist tools. And the question, I guess, that we have is, what does that mean? It means that our graduates here from Imperial, but from all other universities around the globe, are moving into a different workplace. They're moving into a graduate workplace where expectations are different. Not everything has changed. I was on several panels over the last few weeks talking to employers, and one thing that came across very strongly was they are still looking for strong disciplinary expertise. But in addition to that, they're wanting graduates who can work with agentic AI as partners to drive forward their business opportunities. So in one sense, nothing has changed, but we have some additional work to do such that our students are equipped to lead in this new and quickly evolving future. But it has changed, hasn't it? Because how do you become a disciplinary expert now that we all have access to tools which can give us a very high-level answer to most queries that we ask? That is new. And so how do we evolve our education such that in this new world, students are encouraged to generate real understanding and not fake it? We are looking to develop real experts and not phony experts. And so I think this is the real challenge. Traditionally, we've used frameworks like Bloom's taxonomy, where we build up our knowledge and lead towards insights. And I think arguably that approach is not going to work in the current situation that we face. So how are we going to do this? And I think that is the key question which underpins all of the activity which I am involved in thinking about the future of education at Imperial. So we have just launched an AI vision document. I'm not going to present it now because Sophie Rushman, my colleague, who will be closing the proceedings today, is going to say a little bit more about that. And that lays out some of our initial thoughts and direction in which we are heading. And that has been built up as a result of a lot of consultation and work by the AI futurists here in the university. But today, we're focusing on one aspect of that, and that is feedback. And I think we all know that feedback is critical in the learning process. I'm sure that if I asked anyone in this audience, do you remember an occasion when you got feedback which you thought it was a light bulb moment? It was something that really opened up something you've been struggling with. So I think we all have those experiences, and that's where we want to be as an institution. We want to be providing those opportunities, making that as possible, as sort of easy to happen as possible. But I think we've also had the opposite experience. We've all had the experience where the feedback was either it came way too late and we'd moved on, we were no longer really engaged with that problem, or it was so perfunctory that it didn't help us at all. So feedback is absolutely critical. I think we recognize that. And that struggle and getting the balance between struggling to understand things versus getting the answer. You know, what's the answer? Is where we need to find the balance, and it's not a trivial thing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you two little stories, which I think are pre-AI, well, pre-ChatGPT 3.5, let's say, which I think throw some light on the problem and maybe point us in the direction of what we need to do to make sure that we are successful in this endeavor. So back in 2018, I was working with one of my predecessors in this role, Simone Buitendijk, and we were looking at curriculum review, and we were wanting to encourage the use of active learning. This was a concept that had been popularized by Carl Wyman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. And as part of our sort of background to that, we had a trip to UBC, University of British Columbia in Canada. And the reason for going there was that Carl Wyman himself had actually worked with University of British Columbia to embed at large scale some of these ideas of active learning. So one of the key players over there was a Brit called Simon Peacock, and he was the Dean of Science at UBC. And I was in his office, and he told me a story. He said, Alan, well, he actually told the whole group that was there, but he said, I had a student came banging on my door, rushed into my office and said, I am paying 80,000 Canadian dollars a year, and I get into a classroom and my lecturer doesn't give me any answers. They just repeat questions at me. I didn't pay for this service. This is outrageous. So the moral of that story was you need to bring the students with you on a journey to understand why it is you're doing things the way you are, that you believe that that sort of Socratic approach allows you to get a deeper understanding. So I think the first lesson from that story is bring your students with you on the journey. I'm going to go even further back for my second story. So when I was at school, I was studying, among other things, physics at A level. And my school had very recently brought in a new curriculum. It was the Nuffield curriculum. And the Nuffield curriculum, I think, was a very early example of active learning. So it was very experimental, based. We would turn up for our physics lessons and we would have, bits of kit, and our teacher, Dr. Fuller, would say, just play around and see if you can find out a little bit about Young's modulus. And so we'd play around with various materials, hanging things on strings, looking at how they deflected, all this kind of stuff. But then at the end of the day, it kind of finished. We ran out of time and we all left. So we'd played around, but from what I could tell, we hadn't learned anything at all. So I was really enjoying it on the one hand, but I was thinking in the back of my mind, I'm not learning anything here. I don't know what the answer is. And so we went on like this for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then eventually with a couple of friends, we went up to Keith Fuller and we said, this is kind of crazy. We come out of these lessons buzzing, but we don't actually know what we're doing. We've just sort of played around. And we said, you've got to, at the end of the lesson, sort of present what the accepted answer is. And interestingly, he said, that's an interesting thought. He said, I should do that, shouldn't I? But he then pushed back on it. He then pushed back on it and said, you know what I'm going to do is we're going to do it at the beginning of the next lesson, because I want you to be engaged with that through the whole period between when we finish the first lesson and when you start the next lesson, because I want you to be still turning around in your mind, what exactly was I supposed to be learning? And it worked brilliantly. We had this sort of 10-minute session at the beginning where he would go through what the accepted Young's modulus equations were. And he also gave a little bit of history about how it had come about and the actual experiments they had done to come to those conclusions. So I felt very good about that because I was happy. I was now having fun in the lessons and I was learning something. Great. But what I would say is the lesson from that is work with your students. The idea of this Nuffield syllabus was fine, written on paper, but actually how you implemented it was absolutely critical to student learning. And by working with the students, you could get to that sort of better place. So I think that has nothing directly to do with AI, but I think on this journey that we're now going in, looking at how we develop feedback in a world of AI, I think those two things are important. We need to take our students with us, and we need to work with our students to get those solutions. And of course, those two things are very much linked. So that's what I would like you to hold in your minds through the proceedings today. For example, I think the idea that we can have a world-leading professor having a one-to-one with a student in a small group tutorial session is, that's traditionally what students come to a university like Imperial for. They want to learn from the people who are at the cutting edge of research. But we also have bots now which can provide 24-hour answers based on a limited set of data which has been curated by potentially that same professor. And the question is, how do you get that balance between what is best done by a bot, what is best done by the professor or the teaching fellow or the interaction, the human interaction? Where do you get that balance? And I think we need to work with our students. We need to bring them on that journey. And that may well change over time as well. So I think there are huge opportunities, but we've got to be very careful and we've got to work together. So I think I won't say anything more because I'm probably over time, which I probably am. But I hope that you all have a good time today. We have lots of useful conversations and we can get to a place where we understand further what we've been looking at, which is that feedback issue. So I'm going to hand back to Tiffany. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. This is fantastic. And now we will begin our keynote panel session. So it is my great pleasure. Let me change the slides. So it's my great pleasure to introduce all our keynote panelists today, and who will be discussing how generative AI is reshaping feedback practices across higher education. And this includes emerging opportunities, challenges, and implications for students, staff, and institutions. And I think Alan's opening speech are very thought-provoking, especially those two stories. And I absolutely agree that I think we should bring students with us in this journey. And the reason being is that I think we really need to work together, with our students, because there is still so much we don't know. now, a lot of uncertainties. And I think since the 2022, when the GPT launched at that time, I think now it's 2026. I think it's a few years, but we are still trying to navigate this space. And I think so is our students. So I think that message of kind of working with our students is really the key, and we need to bring them with us. So today, we would like to focus on this overarching question: what does feedback mean for us in the age of AI, and how is generative AI reshaping the feedback practices in higher education? Each panelist will speak up to 10 minutes, and we will then move on to the panel discussions and followed by the questions from the audience. We have the QR code. Yes, the QR code there. So you can also submit your questions via the QR code on the screen. And my colleague, Iro, will help to facilitate that and monitor that space. And for external colleagues, we would love to hear your perspective too. So we have around 40 to 50 external attendees today. So very welcome. And we know the different institutions do different things. So it would be really great that we created this sharing space. We will do our best to relay the questions to the panels, but of course there will be mic like going around, so you can also ask questions in person to our panelists. And also this session will be recorded for wider sharing afterwards. Okay, so I will now give a very brief introductions to all four speakers. So if I can invite our two speakers who join us in person today. We also have two speakers joining us. Yeah, if you want to go onto the stage. Yeah, thank you. And we also, if the AV team, if you can turn the speaker's screen. We have two speakers joining online, and because they are currently based in different time zones, so I will introduce them one at a time. So our first speaker is Professor Naomi Winston. She is a professor of educational psychology in the Surrey Institute of Education at the University of Surrey. She is a principal teaching fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a UK National Teaching Fellow. Naomi specializes in the processing and the impact of instructional feedback and works internationally to embed learning-focused approach to feedback feedback into practice. In her presentation, Naomi will explore how GenAI can be integrated into a feedback ecosystem guided in care, trust, and professional judgments. Our second speaker is Dr. Thomas Colbin. If you want to wave on screen, yes. So a research fellow at the Center for Research in Assessments and Digital Learning at Deakin University, Australia. His work focuses on how GenAI is changing assessment, feedback, and student reading. In his presentation, Thomas will offer a critical perspectives on the role of GenAI in feedback, and he will argue that effective feedback is fundamentally relational, something GenAI cannot easily replicate. Our third speaker is Dr. Sayed Kazem Ben Hashim, a senior lecturer in AI in education at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. And his research focuses on intersection of GenAI and feedback, with particular attention to how these can be integrated into the educational practice. In his presentation, Kazem will explore pedagogically grounded approach to using GenAI to enhance feedback. Our fourth speaker, Dr. Injen Zhang. Dr. Injen Zhang, who is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the Education University of Hong Kong. She specializes in feedback literacy, technology-enhanced assessments, and GenAI enhanced feedback. In her presentation, Jen will offer important insights into how students actually engage with GenAI feedback and what this means for learning. Okay, so I would like to welcome our first speaker, Naomi. Over to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and it's really lovely to be here to talk about the things that occupy my time at the moment more than anything else, feedback and generative AI. So what I want to talk about in my 10 minutes is the importance of care in feedback processes. I don't just mean we need to care for our students, I mean we need to care for us as educators. We need to respect our discipline, what knowledge means in our discipline, and also we need to respect the scholarship of feedback. And in particular, over the last 15 to 20 years, there has been a seismic shift in the scientific literature on feedback, which has repositioned feedback away from simply being comments or information towards feedback as a process. And I believe that the effective and careful use of AI in feedback means we have to recognise feedback as a process, not just comments. Otherwise, we're going to be investing time and resource in answering fundamentally the wrong question in feedback. So, how many of you have ever felt that you spent time, effort writing detailed feedback comments only to feel like they never land anywhere? It's like a message in a bottle. Yes, loads of you, right? We spend so much time on feedback, and along the way in higher education, largely because of student satisfaction and the massification, marketisation of higher education, we've come to believe that more feedback is a good thing. If we want to improve feedback, we need to write more of it. Somewhere we've gone horribly wrong in this process. It's not about doing more. And so if we have a situation where we are writing lots of comments and they're not landing, students are not having an opportunity to use them, they're not even opening and reading them, that's not care. It's not care for us and the time that we invest in that process. And it's certainly not care for our students if it's not helping them to learn and move forwards. So if this happens, if we write detailed comments and nothing happens, students aren't able to use them, that's not a student problem. It's a feedback design problem. It means we haven't considered the thoughtful design of feedback so that information can go somewhere, so that it can actually have an impact. So what if the problem isn't that we're doing too little in feedback, but that we're doing too much of the wrong thing? We're treating feedback as comments, as information, and spending time writing more of them, using different tools to write them, rather than actually thinking about how we design feedback processes so that students use them. So fundamentally for me, as I talk through these ideas, when I say the word feedback, I don't mean comments. I don't mean things that are written on a page in a feedback form, even spoken to students. Feedback is a process. Comments are an input into that process. They're a fundamental input into that process, but they only become feedback when learners engage with, use them, and something changes as a result. So I've got two examples of feedback here. The one on the left was the level of feedback I got as an undergraduate in the early 2000s. Can you imagine if we gave this to our students now? I think they might riot. And on the other side is page 1 of 2 of the length of comments I'm expected to write for an undergraduate now. So I'll ask you the question, which of these is better feedback? One on the left. Yeah, less can be more, I agree. Or the one on the right. The answer is neither, because neither of these are feedback. This isn't feedback. This is comments. This is information. It's not feedback. It only becomes feedback if something happens. And so in this case, they both look like feedback, but the question of whether they're any good is whether they function as feedback. Do they change something meaningful for the learner? At the end of last year, myself and a group of colleagues put out a manifesto for feedback in the age of generative AI, with a series of principles that we believe are fundamental to guide decision-making about how we embed AI into feedback processes. Now, I believe there is huge potential for AI to revolutionise feedback processes. As I will come to, I do not believe we do that by using AI simply to write comments. Otherwise, we're simply replicating this transmission, message in a bottle model with a different medium. So as I go through, I will make reference to some of the points within this manifesto as to how they relate to meaningful, careful design of feedback using AI tools. Apparently we're stuck on the manifesto. There we go. So alongside the manifesto, we also published a paper on the careful craft of feedback in an age of generative AI. Now, when we talk about care here, we're not talking about feedback becoming more fluffy and more caring and not giving students the really difficult information they need to hear sometimes. We're talking about feedback as a process that needs care embedded in it. That is care for students, but it's also care for us. It's care for the scholarship, it's care for the expertise that drives knowledge around feedback and what it should be. Fundamentally, if we want to improve feedback for our students and we want to make feedback work, it isn't about writing more, and it's not about using different tools to write more quickly. It's about designing feedback that does more work, feedback that has more impact and makes more of a difference for students. So we don't necessarily want to give students more information. We need to help them become better at using it so that it can have more of an impact. Which is why I believe if we focus in our design of AI into feedback processes simply on using AI to write feedback comments, all we're doing is replicating the message in a bottle with a different tool, with a different medium. Because it's still information, it's still only an input into a process. And if we want feedback to actually work, it's got to do something, it's got to change something. And simply spitting out more comments to students, no matter how quickly that comes, is not feedback. So if our value as humans in feedback processes isn't about writing comments, what is it? Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think Thomas is going to pick this up really nicely in his talk about what is the unique value of humans in feedback processes. But if students can get pages of instant comments from generative AI, we've already lost to AI. If our fundamental role in feedback is to write comments, we've got to do more. We've got to think about design and how we can enable students to get more from feedback. So when I talk about careful feedback, what I mean here is what can't be automated and how do we prioritize that? So in the last few minutes, I'm going to suggest a shift. 3 ways for us to do less feedback, but to make it more likely to actually change students' learning and change students' thinking. The first one is to give students less feedback. We give students way too much. When we look at eye tracking studies of students' engagement with feedback, they skim it. When we look at studies about how often students open feedback files in a virtual learning environment, if they can see the grade, they often don't open the feedback file. So the answer is not giving more. The answer is giving less, but making that feedback more impactful. Last year, we launched a new tool called Feedback Empower Tools, which is a freely available suite of explainer videos, resources, and tools to enable students to work with feedback. So we've taken what we know are the most common challenges for students to use feedback, things like managing emotion, things like dealing with conflicting feedback, even how to use AI to help make sense of feedback. And for each one, we've given students tools, concrete tools that they can use to work with feedback. So we pass the responsibility to them. We can give them information, but we can also enable them to make more from feedback. Second, we can think in a really principled way about how we use AI in feedback processes. I think there is huge potential, but we have to remember that feedback is a process, not just comments. If, as educators and as feedback researchers, we were going to think about what AI can do in feedback, and we started from scratch, we wouldn't focus on just writing comments. We'd think about what are the challenges for a student in using feedback and making use of feedback, and what can AI do to help us? So one of the real challenges, as an example, that we have in massified higher education is modularized curricula. If I'm marking a piece of work from a student, I want to be able to comment on not just how well they've done on that piece of work, but how well they've improved from the one they did before. And I want to know where they're going next so that I can give meaningful advice for improvement, not generic advice. But we rarely see where our students have come from and where they're going. So what if AI could help us to bridge those gaps? What if rather than delivering feedback, the principled use of AI and feedback was to help make feedback more of a journey? Or to help students synthesize multiple pieces of information from peers, from teachers, from their own self-evaluation, and generate really concrete steps for improvement. So there are exciting uses of AI in feedback. In my view, it's not about writing comments. And finally, we can make feedback a matter of design. So back in 2022, David Bowd and I argued that one of the biggest problems we have in higher education is that we always put assessment and feedback together. What if the most useful time to provide students with information about their performance wasn't at the end, after an assignment has been completed? It becomes entangled with the grade, it becomes entangled with our processes. What if feedback actually sits better somewhere else? And so we often talk about assessment design. How often do we talk about feedback design? Thinking about where we best position our time and resource so that information on performance can have the biggest impact on learning. So, we've been led to believe in higher education that good feedback means more feedback. I disagree, particularly in a world where comments, information are now abundant. So careful feedback isn't about writing more, it's about making feedback work. And if it's not being used or students can't use it, then we're not exercising care. So here's something to leave with you. If you were to take all of the workload hours you currently spend on feedback that you know is not necessarily having an impact, what would you do with them instead to help students learn?
Thank you so much, Naomi. Now I would like to invite our second speaker, Thomas. So AB team, could you please turn the screen to for online speaker? Right. Thomas, yep, the floor is yours. Feel free to share your screen.
Fabulous. We'll see if I can figure out how to share my screen, which may or may not work. But while I'm figuring out how to do this, that was a fantastic talk, Naomi. But for everybody in the room, that point about us being led to believe something and taking it on board, I think is really important for this talk, because from Naomi's talk, you might be led to believe that the slides in this general keynote are going to be professional and well crafted, and that is not going to be the case. It's certainly not going to be the case if I can't figure out how to upload them, which is seeming more and more to be the case, but we'll see what we do. Oh, here we go. Look at this. Now you invite only the best professionals to this thing, I'm sure. Is this working? Can people see things? The only person I can see is Naomi. Can I have a thumbs up or thumbs up? Fabulous. Look at that. Marvelous. All right, that was about the first minute of my time. So what I'm going to be talking about comes directly out of what Naomi's talking about. That is literal because I was writing these slides as she was talking, because I was changing them, because I suddenly thought, that's a great perspective. I should have talked about this way before. So I wrote this paper last year or something called The Wicked Problem of AI in Assessment. And it's about assessment. It's not about feedback, but it should have been. Because one of the things that we argue in this paper is that, well, AI and assessment constitutes a wicked problem. But what that means is multiple things, including the way we define a problem dictates the kind of solutions that are eligible for that problem. So when we think about assessment, we can think about the same things about feedback. So we could think about the problem of feedback being a workload issue. We could think about it as being a bunch of issues, and that will define the way we think about the solutions. But if we're thinking about feedback in that very narrow informational concept, that comments kind of framing, then the solution is AI, obviously, because a sentence is a sentence. A proposition, Paris is the capital of France, is true or false. It doesn't matter if that comes from Naomi or comes from David Bowd or whoever. It's just a sentence and it's true or false. The things that matter about that sentence are when it comes, how accurate it is, those kind of things that AI actually does quite well, especially compared to people. So if we get lulled into or led to believe that that's the kind of conversation that we need to have, those how to improve the accuracy of single sentences in isolation, then it's going to be hard for us to think about what students need out of feedback, but also what our role is in this kind of conversation. So I think I'm going to waste a whole bunch of time talking about that. But before I get there, one of the things I wanted to point out was just some background data. So this is from a study I did in 2024. So it's a couple of years old. We're repeating it now. But one thing we saw back then, out of 8,000 or 8,500 students, 7,000 answered this. Have you used AI for feedback? 50% said yes. An additional 30% said no, but I didn't know that I could. I'll try that. So the first thing that I think is important to have in mind going into this is that this isn't just a conversation that we're having in private rooms, then going back and solving for our students. Students are already in large numbers using AI for feedback, regardless of what we think, regardless of what we say. It's going on. So it's really important that we're thinking about what harms might occur from that, what benefits, how we include those kind of conversations in our classrooms and with students. So one of the things that I think is always important is to point out that AI does quite useful feedback, and I'm going to skip over that because I've wasted a bunch of time talking about other crap. But one of the things that students say is that AI does give me accurate stuff. So there's a lot of discussion about hallucinations, but we know that students say that it's accurate. We also know that it's positive and encouraging. It can be tailored. But the three things in bold here are what students say more than anything else in the studies that I've run. It's fast, it's private, and it's clear. Students struggle with privacy because being seen can be embarrassing. They struggle with fastness because waiting for feedback can be annoying, and clarity because if you get that one shot 2 weeks after your assessment and it's not clear and you don't know how to include it, then it's all a bit of a waste of time. So these three things are what I think is often talked about from a student perspective in GenAI, and it's what I want to talk about in terms of what the difference is between humans and students. So these are three quotes from a study that I did. It's available online. I'll put the link at the end. But these three things, these three statements, I think are quite interesting from a student perspective. So the first one, I won't read them all. I'm sure people are reading them as we speak. But the first one is about context and specificity. I believe that whoever the nice gentleman who opened our proceedings was talking about students going off and seeing those cutting edge professors, and that's one of the things that students care about. There's people who actually have that cutting edge knowledge being in a room with them. But the other thing is talking about target, time. But the other thing is embarrassment. Embarrassment to ask questions to people, embarrassment to allow people to see you struggling is huge. Identity can be an extremely fragile thing, and I think that's an important thing to think about. So these two papers are what I'm going to summarize super quickly, but they're available online, so you can go read them at your own leisure. These papers I wrote with Joanna Tai and Jean Flannery, great people, and we're interested in that thing that makes human feedback valuable and important. What's going on with feedback that makes it matter so much to so many people? And I think one of the things that was said in the opening to our event was a lot of us can look back on feedback as being that valuable thing for us. So I can't actually see anybody in the room. I can only see myself, and I can kind of see Naomi. But I think everybody in this room can probably think about some reason that they're in this room, and probably that's the kind of thing that would be a human-based thing, right? What do I mean by that? So I'm here because I read something and I talked to someone and they said, oh shit, that's really interesting. And I kept talking, and then suddenly I had a PhD. I just kept talking and going down that route because I was amazed that people thought what I thought was interesting. I came from a very poor background. I didn't think I was capable of doing that. But when someone saw me as capable of doing that, that changed what I was interested in, my motivations. My basic point, I think, in both of these papers is no one is going to be in this room that we're sitting at now because AI saw what their potential would be. We're sitting here because people saw it. Because when someone sees you, when all of you looking at each other now, when Naomi was just talking a minute ago, all of you in the room were looking at her. That matters. It matters that Naomi's in that room rather than by herself. What it means to be sharing things matters because our identities are fragile, but they're also formed by the way people recognize us. So recognition is the concept that I'm really interested in. And very much like what Naomi was talking about in regards to care, it's not enough just to think, oh, well, I know what that word means. It's just some lefty, huggy, feely thing. That's not what we meant. Recognition is not just seeing someone and saying nice things about them. AI can do that perfectly well, and it's not all that valuable to students as a result. They think that it's not trustworthy as a result. That's not what I mean by recognition. What I mean by recognition is the way that people see us, such that it allows us to inhabit, sustain, and develop our identities. And by identity, I again mean something concrete, which are the social roles and statuses that confer entitlements. Now, this matters not just for students, it matters for us. I was talking to a teacher yesterday who said, I'm so sick of giving feedback because I'm so often the first human being who's ever read the paper. Students submit things without actually having read them before. And that matters because what it means to be a teacher is to have people identify you as a teacher and look at you as such. And feedback's one of those positions. It's a way that we identify we exercise agency, either as students or teachers, and become those people we want to be becoming. That's the basic structure of recognition, that one can only be recognized by someone who has that status to do that. And AI doesn't have that. So this is what we talk about in the paper. It's much more complicated and something I won't go into now, but this is the basic point. So we divide feedback into two forms: recognitive feedback and extra recognitive feedback. Recognitive feedback is feedback where people can recognize each other. Extra recognitive is where it can't happen. This is the definition that we give. Feedback, which is recognitive, has the capacity to engage in mutual recognition between feedback provider and recipient in ways that confirm identity and allow for the successful transformation of information. I won't talk about that too much yet. I'm sure we'll talk about it later. Extra cognitive feedback doesn't have this. Now, I know that this is a practice-based event and we're very focused on what we can do with this information. So combining this idea about recognition and combining some of the things about feedback, I thought I'd just sum up by having 4 or 5 things which sum up my suggestions, basically, because I've got no idea how fast I've been talking or how long I've been going for. So the first thing is that assume that students will be using it. So if your goal today is to come up here and to learn more about AI, to learn more about how AI can be used in feedback and to go off and improve practices, I think the first thing is to assume that students will be using it. A good proportion of them are likely to be. That means that talking about it and thinking about it is important and ignoring it isn't an option. The second thing is to support students to interpret and evaluate GenAI feedback, because GenAI feedback might not be all that it's cracked up to be. It can be great, it's not always great, but supporting students to allow them to interpret it is really important. Considering AI as extending and not replacing feedback is my third recommendation. GenAI can be useful for all sorts of stuff. It can be what I call a great sandpit for exploring ideas, because actual human feedback, like I said, can be extremely intimidating and a real fragile experience that, by and large, students don't want to do. Humans, by and large, don't want to do it. Therefore, allowing AI to be extending feedback practices can be an extremely valuable way to allow students to get the most out of their feedback experience in higher education. Next one, unsurprisingly, seeing feedback as an opportunity for recognition rather than just fast, timely, accurate feedback is, I suspect, where we're going to find the most benefit and where we have our most value as teachers. Finally, designing feedback opportunities with humans across modules and courses and units is, I think, the final suggestion that I've got, because feedback is unlikely to be, GenAI feedback is unlikely to be sufficient on its own. Tailoring comments and feedback experiences to students to enable them to take the next step is, I think, what I would finally conclude with, although no doubt we'll have more time to talk in the proceeding however long. So I've got no idea if that was 10 minutes, but thank you very much. I'll pass it over to whoever else and we'll save the extra time, or we'll make up the extra time later.
Great, thank you so much, Thomas. Okay, so again, shall I welcome you? Go first. Yep.
Yeah. Can we share also here the slides? Maybe I can stand to see the slides because I don't see it here. Yeah? Oh, it's here. It's okay. I will see. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's a great honor to be here today. Naomi talked about the feedback design and see it as a process rather than a product, and Thomas talked about feedback recognition. Today I'm going to talk this concept a little bit from a different perspective, and I hope that together we can come up with some nice also home takeaway lessons actually. Almost a year ago, together with my co-authors, we proposed a framework for hybrid intelligent feedback. And in the last year that I've been giving trainings to students, to teachers, and also being involved in policy decisions with AI, I have come to these realizations that there are some missing items in this picture, and there are some risks that has to be acknowledged. So today I'm going to share this, my thoughts with you, and yeah, let's see how it goes. Maybe in a nutshell, when we talk about feedback, we could say that the feedback in general looks like this, where we have traditionally, if we call it human-centered, we always deal with teacher feedback, peer feedback, and so call it self-assessment or self-feedback. And for the feedback to be basically effective, we expect this feedback to be timely and also to be personalized, where it is tailored to the specific needs of students and also to the context that they are learning in. And also the feedback features, where that the comments that if we consider it as a process as well, I think it has to include some valuable comments regarding the, for example, identifying the problems and also the justifications of that problems, and also to teach our students that what are the ways to improve this. And also I think it's important to give some compliments to them. So that's maybe pulling this all together, we can call it as a nice feedback. Moving from this, now we have a new agent joining to this literature, where we have AI that after ChatGPT launch, we know that how like human-like text that it's been produced by these AI tools are so accurate, are so like human-like, and it's almost impossible to detect whether it's been written by AI or by human. And also the level of reasoning and accuracy has been tremendously improved. Of course, not it's there. So we have this, that it's coming to this picture, right? And maybe we can see in two ways how AI can actually help with feedback. One is that the AI can stand alone, as where we can see the feedback that completely generated by AI, and it's been delivered to students. But from a pedagogical perspective, there is a problem with this, in my opinion, and that's the lack of human agency or teacher agency. There are literature showing that when we provide feedback, we actually learn. And even there are literature showing that when feedback providers learn even more than feedback receivers. So feedback, like Naomi said, is a learning process. And it's not just about the comment to give to students, but it's about the learning. And when we just simply use AI and just have generated outcome and just to deliver to students, we are taking away this agency, the learning process from students. And also for the teachers also, I believe that there are always rooms to learn from their own feedback. So the other scenarios that where we can see where AI collaborates or with teachers, with peers, or with students themselves, and we call it like human AI collaboration feedback. And in that way, maybe we can assume 3 scenarios that where it can possibly done. Maybe there are more scenarios, but that's what I have come to this. One is that first, let's say teachers, peers, or learners, they generate their own feedback and they use AI to enrich, to improve their feedback, either their feedback in terms of language, clarity, or extension of their justifications. The other way is that first they ask AI to generate feedback, and then they have their own input and enrichment towards that. And the other scenario is that where we don't have that kind of a decision from the beginning, and it's more like interaction between human and AI, and it's like iterations of the cycle going between these two and coming to the optimized feedback. But when it comes to implementation and reality, there are some challenges. The first one is the ethics and privacy. For example, in our institutions, teachers are not allowed to share students' works with AI, and neither the course materials. Students are also not allowed to share their peers' works with AI. And even though if they are allowed to share, how can we make sure that they they make sure that it's completely anonymized and there's no personal information to be shared there. So that's one part that when it comes to reality, we need to acknowledge that the AI, especially the open AI, that the tools that are commercial, maybe they are not like the safe environment to share this. And the other one is also the transparency. We know that there is this huge kind of pressure on educators, on students, that it's kind of a negative perspective towards using AI. So even though in some cases that the students or teachers are using, probably they are less willing to be transparent. And even though if they want to be transparent, what is the good protocol to show this transparency and acknowledge the way they use and they cited their AI? And these citations, acknowledgement of use of AI, I think requires good attention. And also the over-reliance. Even though we are coming to use AI in relation to human interactions, how do we can mitigate the risk of over-relying on using AI? And that also requires some protocols, some guidelines, I think, when it comes to the implementation. Next to that, when we talk about AI, we all know that AI has its own limits as well. One big one is the hallucinations. There's actually a recent publication on Nature shows that AI tricked scientists to invent a fake disease. And this kind of misleading of AI should kind of be a point for us to rethink and carefully pay attention to use of AI in our education. And also the bias is there, the gender bias is there, the racial bias is there. And even from a little bit broader perspective, AI use in education in general does not come without cost to our environment, to our society, or to our the emotional risk that it brings to our younger generations. For example, for the environmental impact, to cool down these AI engines, it costs a lot of environmental costs. So the question here is that how far are we going to go of integrating AI in our education, and whether the cost outweighs the benefits of using AI for education. And when it comes to the human side, and I think we are really we have long way to go to train our educators and our students to learn how to responsibly, ethically, critically, and transparently use AI. I think this is very, very important. And we know that there are a lot of challenges to simply trust AI outcomes. And that also, I believe, is related to AI literacy. Our students, our teachers need to be AI literate to know what is the limits of AI, what is the strengths of AI. And that would help also to have a good understanding of to what extent they can trust AI outputs. So moving from these risks and challenges, I think one also maybe a fundamental question that we can ask here, it's also some initial thoughts, but I think it's good to consider, is from epistemological perspective. Maybe for the first time ever in our history, we can simply talk about an agent that is intelligent in some way more or less than us, and in some scholars actually call it a cognition, a different cognition, artificial cognition that has totally different mechanism of cognition, where the computational thinking is way much more stronger than human and accessing to this data. And that brings us to the fact that what does knowledge mean in this age? In the past, we used to have the knowledge constructions maybe in the form of human-human interaction. Now we have knowledge co-constructions with AI interactions. And what does this mean for trustworthy knowledge? What does this mean for co-creation, co-thinking? Or can we think about co-regulations? And even if that's something the case, what does this mean for feedback in general? How does this impact feedback theories, for example? In the past, the feedback theories we had was mainly considering the fact that human feedback is naturally human-centered. But now we have two different cognitions. And does this impact the way we redefine or conceptualize feedback? I think this is something that maybe needs to be considered. And to complete also this picture, I think mostly we discuss on the fact that how we can use AI to provide feedback, either or to compare AI feedback with teacher feedback, AI feedback to peer feedback. But on the other hand, I think what the picture is missing is the uptake side. Even when it comes to uptake, mostly the discussion was that whether students uptake or implement feedback that they receive from AI or not. But the question here is that, as we know that our students, they don't have enough feedback literacy, at least not to a large extent, right? So sometimes they struggle to understand even the feedback they receive. So the question here is that, is there a pattern here that AI can support implementation of feedback? What if the feedback is too complicated to be understood by students? Whether AI can help students to accept feedback, to modify feedback, to elaborate feedback or not. I think putting all this together maybe could give us a little bit big picture, a better picture of hybrid intelligent feedback, and also we should be mindful of the risk, as I said, in reality that we use, and pay attention to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kazan. Now I would like to invite our fourth speaker, Jen. So could you turn that into the people who joined online? Right, fantastic. Jen, the floor is yours. If you are ready, feel free to share your slides.
Can you see that? Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you. And thank for my discussion panel members, wonderful and insightful sharing. And I think I agree. Yeah, feedback as a process where the students need recognition, and also in this process, the human and the GenAI need to play a partnership. And also now I would like to tend to the most important stakeholders in the feedback practices, that is students. So I'd like to share my recent study on how students engage with the generative AI feedback. Okay. So you may wonder why it's so important to understand students' engagement with GenAI feedback. I'm sorry if yeah, that's great. Okay. So as we know, there is a shift of the feedback paradigm from teachers' information transmission to a dialogic learner-centered process in higher education. So GenAI is now part of that conversation. So it's immediate, interactive, and always available. So it can produce the human-like dialogues with students at scale. So that matters because feedback is something higher education values highly, but it's also one of the hardest teaching practices to do well. So it often gets limited by workload, large class sizes, time pressure, and the lack of opportunities for sustained dialogue. At the same time, the institutions have sometimes responded to GenAI before we have very strong evidence-based understanding of how students are actually using these tools. So we can see that the GenAI offers both opportunities and the challenges for the feedback practices. So we are discussing today. So on the one side, GenAI feedback is timely, personalized, scalable, actionable, interactive, and multimodal. On the other side, GenAI feedback can be biased and misleading and cause our concern about technology over dependence, academic integrity, lack of contextual understanding and relational connections, as well as the digital divide. So just now our members discussing about this. So as the Chinese proverb says, so we need to leverage our strengths while avoiding pitfalls. So how can we do this? I believe the first step is to conduct a fundamental study to understand how students actually engage with GenAI feedback. Only by examining the students' usage patterns, interpretation of feedback, and subsequent learning actions can we identify what works, what may be misleading or risky. and how educators can design supports and guidelines that maximize the benefits while minimizing harm. So what do we mean by feedback engagement, and how can we categorize it? So student feedback engagement involves how students receive, perceive, interpret, and utilize the information provided by them. It's not easy to categorize feedback engagement. So we can categorize it into passive and active engagement, or we can use a three-dimensional model of engagement to group them into cognitive, affective, and behavioral dimensions. I will refer to these three dimensions later. And if we want to compare and contrast students' engagement with GenAI feedback and with human feedback, what differences should we expect to see? I summarize three main differences here. First, GenAI is an on-demand and personalized feedback tool. Therefore, the interaction between GenAI and students largely depends on students' proactivity and agency. However, the interaction between students and humans like teachers and peers differs. So even without students' prompts, the interaction will still occur if their teachers or peers want to have a conversation with them. In addition, students' interaction with GenAI may cause less anxiety than that with humans because they do not have to navigate human relationships in any feedback encounters. However, students need to manage their trust level in the GenAI system to enact its feedback and be aware of the ethics of using it in their learning. So furthermore, interaction with the GenAI can leave digital footprints, which can help students, cyclically reflect on their feedback process. So this is very difficult to realize in the interactions with humans because such interactions are always difficult to trace back. So therefore, it's reasonable to assume when engaging with GenAI feedback, students will think, feel, and act differently. So this triggered me to explore how a group of students engaged with the feedback provided by ChatGPT on their eyes writing tasks. This is not an intervention study. I would like to examine the students' engagement with GenAI feedback in a natural setting. So I used unobtrusive observation, stimulated recall interviews, and log data to examine the students' engagement with ChatGPT feedback. So based on my findings of the study, I expanded the three-dimensional model of engagement I mentioned before into a four-dimensional model. So in this model, cognitive engagement involves how students interpret and judge GenAI feedback. And while metacognitive engagement is about the process by which students actively reflect on, plan, and regulate their use of it. And affective engagement involves students' emotional reactions and their trust in GenAI feedback. And behavioral engagement includes the students' feedback prompts, interaction with the GenAI, and the revisions they make. So the four-dimensional model emphasizes the metacognitive engagement in the GenAI context, adjusting the potential risk of metacognitive laziness. So in this study, most participants tended to simply read the ChatGPT feedback and make judgments, but seldom use it for self-regulation or planning for future work. So this study provides the qualitative evidence to demonstrate that metacognitive laziness may prompt short-term performance improvements and long-term scale stagnation. So student feedback engagement and feedback literacy are deeply interconnected. Therefore, students may need distinct feedback literacy to effectively engage with GenAI feedback. And in turn, actively engaging with GenAI feedback can also promote student feedback literacy. So in our study, we identified most of the participants' use of comparison to process the information provided by ChatGPT. It means that students continuously exercise their evaluative judgment. So feedback literate students in the context of GenAI should acquire a skill such as comparing and evaluating different sources of feedback. assessing their work against the established criteria, and discerning the change of GenAI feedback over time. In addition, we found that fewer participants experienced metacognitive engagement with ChatGPT. So to be feedback literate, students must set feedback goals, plan the subsequent prompts to elicit the desired feedback, self-observe and self-monitor the interactions with GenAI, and reflect on the whole feedback processes. As for effective engagement, students appeared comfortable and relaxed when interacting with ChatGPT, which indicates the very positive effective engagement. However, students are required to have the ability to do emotional reflexivity, which is closely related to their trust within the GenAI systems. Feedback literate students need to balance their trust and doubt by understanding the GenAI's capabilities and limitations. And the participants' behavioral engagement appeared superficial in requesting feedback, interacting with ChatGPT, and revising their writing tasks. How to prevent? On the one hand, prompt engineering is necessary. Students need to develop their abilities to design effective questions or stimuli. In addition, students should be able to make ethical decisions, which requires them to critically evaluate and contextualize the GenAI feedback rather than accepting it directly or using it directly. So to summarize, we should not rely on assumptions. Students' real engagement must be studied. Policy and pedagogy around GenAI should be grounded in the evidence about how students actually interpret, trust, monitor, and actual GenAI feedback. Cognitive engagement alone is not enough in GenAI contexts. There is a need to explicitly support planning and regulation, not just the interpretation. Effective engagement looks positive, but it brings a trust challenge. And students need to develop their emotional reflexivity. Behavioral engagement may become superficial without guidance. So this makes prompting skills and ethical decision making crucial. So there are some research questions need in-depth explorations. So I list some of them here to trigger your further thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. So now we are going to move on to the panel discussion. Okay, so thank you so much for all your great and thought-provoking presentations. So I suppose let's dive into some issues a bit deeper. And I think there are a lot of like crossovers, and also, you know, the biggest themes is like a trust, right? I think that is a very important thing. So many of you have highlighted these ideas of feedback is fundamentally relational. So my questions to the panel is that in higher educations, what role can AI play, and what must remain human? Do you have any thought on that? Yeah. So what must, so in this age of, in this context, you know, in higher education, and we know the AI now permeate in different areas, you know, in higher education, and in terms of the feedback practice, what must remain human, and what roles can AI play? So yeah, anyone would like to go first? Thomas? Yeah, Thomas, go ahead.
Did you just stop me in, did you? Thanks. I must admit, I got sidetracked thinking about trust, because everybody did start talking about trust. And when it comes to the way we think about feedback and what makes human feedback interesting or important even, I think trust is a slippery one. Students don't trust AI by and large, but they don't kind of need to for a lot of tasks. I mean, I don't by and large trust, well, I was going to use my wife as an example, but then I realized she's in the other room. So there's all sorts of people I might trust in some circumstances, but might not in other circumstances, professional or otherwise. And using universals is always going to be tricky. And I think AI as a word is tricky here. We've all talked about, and I'm as guilty as anybody else, talking about AI as a thing. And generally speaking, in this panel, we've meant chatbot. So we've kind of thought, what's the difference between ChatGPT and us and what we're doing? But students aren't just using AI. I mean, what they're doing when they sit down with it is a myriad of practices that we're really interested in, and we're actually quite good at talking about. So when we swap that over for I think we can end up fighting ghosts a little bit. I worry that we're kind of creating a fetish out of AI, this thing that exists just because we talk about it a lot. But when we actually sit down and talk about it, and the last talk was so good on this, focusing on what students are actually doing, I think we're going to find that there's actually very concrete practices that we're actually already experts on. And most of the people in this room aren't tech experts and don't have any bloody interest in being a tech expert. So when it comes to thinking about the difference between human and AI, it might be a difference about what in particular we're interested in. What specific thing are we talking about at any given time? I think that will actually answer the question quite well, because when we start getting into specifics rather than broad universal claims about humans versus teachers, I think it's pretty obvious.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Any other panelists that would like to come along? Yeah, Naomi.
Yeah, so there's some brilliant research by Jackie Tuck, which talks about feedback as a social practice, that when we look at feedback information, it's so much more than just the words on a page. Feedback does work. And when we are writing a comment to a student, we are attending to what she calls their backstories, and I would add also their future stories as well. And that matters, even if we're marking work anonymously. As a teacher, we still know the broader context of what our students are doing that week, what they might be going through in terms of preparation for exams at a similar time, what we talk to them about in terms of graduate outcomes. So if we see feedback as a social practice, which arguably it is, then there is a fundamental role for us in understanding that broader context and attending to that, not just in what we write, but the way we write. So she talks about how she adjusts not only the language of her feedback comments, but also the ways in which she engages in feedback conversations with students, by her knowledge of them and by her knowledge of what else is going on. And it comes back to that point about being in the room with experts, with the people that our students want to learn from. So feedback as a process means it's more than comments. Humans are essential, particularly feedback as a social process.
Okay, thank you.
Can I also add something?
Yes, go ahead.
I also want to look from a different perspective. I think to remain human side and AI side, I think we can also maybe look from this perspective that if we're dealing with low order thinking skills, like if the purpose of the feedback is just simply to transfer a fact and knowledge or a technical skills, I think in that sense we can leave some space, more space to AI. But if we are dealing with higher order thinking skills, like where we want students to be able to have a good level of evaluation skills or decision-making skills, or how to, or even more importantly, if we are dealing with attitudes, and in that sense, I think we should be careful in terms of using AI. And I don't never forget that back in my bachelor, one of my teachers gave me feedback, and it has stayed with me so far, and that was really like I'd say like a brain lightening or something, and I think we should not miss that part.
Can I just add a very slight tail to that? Like I'm not in the room, so I don't know if I'm ruining everything or adding something valuable. Is that all right? I just get slightly concerned because if we're going to divide things between what humans should be doing and what AI should be doing, so say higher order things versus lower order things, or simple things versus complicated things, then we want to be careful we're not making judgments about what's important to students. I remember I got feedback when I was in primary school about some of my Japanese, like week one stuff. and I was so shit at it, like phenomenally, like so bad people couldn't get their head around it. Like the most basic stuff I couldn't do. And a teacher spent so much time with me going through it, and it meant so much to me. And I didn't keep going because I was still shit at it, but it would just change the way I thought about what teachers were and who they were to me and what my place was in the class. And from a objective perspective, that's the kind of basic stuff that just could get wiped out. And you just say, just get AI to do it. And maybe that would work, and maybe it wouldn't. And I get worried that by saying there's certain categories of things that we can just delegate and certain categories of things we can't delegate, we might be making jumping a bit too fast about certain things.
Yeah, I think it's a very, depends on the context and the target groups. So I would like to compliment that. For me, I think GenAI in the feedback process it plays the major roles in scaffolding. Because I think the GenAI has some functions. For example, we take the multimodal as a functions. Recently, I interviewed my students. So they told me they don't understand the assessment criteria. So they asked the GenAI to explain that in plain language, and even use the photographs and the figures to show the criteria, the structures. So I think GenAI can help a lot in this to provide some scaffolding. But for humans, for students, they need to develop their evaluative judgment. Okay, so this is very important. As for the teachers, just now, Naomi mentioned that care about students, care about ourselves. So I think for teachers also need to develop their professional judgment. So we cannot rely on the GenAI to produce the feedback for us to reduce our workload. Of course, we need our professional judgment. And also another thing is the accountability. So the teachers need to be accountable for the feedback they provide to the students. And also students need to be accountable for their revised work. Yeah, I think this is my opinion.
Great. Thank you for all your thoughts. So, based on what I have heard, I think this word, when we are navigating the space, I think we need to be intentional. And I think many of you mentioned about, this depends on the context, depends on the learning outcomes, depending on the things that we wish student to develop. So I suppose my next questions is more like from practical perspectives. So in your views or based on your experience, what does Gen AI and where does the Gen AI and also the kind of contribute to this feedback practice? What may be that most valuable point at this right now at this point in time, and where should educators be more cautious? Do you have any practical experiences you can share?
Happy to say something to that one. I think in terms of where AI can be generative in feedback processes, it means just starting from that basic representation of feedback as a process. Because as Thomas said, the way we frame a problem fundamentally directs us towards different ideas for solutions or approaches. And if we conceptualize feedback as a process, then the way we might embed feedback into it is very different to if we just see feedback as a product and comments. So if we, in the paper, we talk about the importance of a respect for not only the professional craft of teachers and what we do within feedback, but also respect for scholarship and quite a large body of research looking into this idea of feedback as a process. So I think if we want to ask the right questions about what AI can and should do in feedback, that's the fundamental to me, is start with feedback as a process and think about the challenges of enacting feedback as a process in mass higher education, and there are many, and think about how AI can help us solve those problems, not just how to spit out more comments faster.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Any other thoughts from the panel? Yeah, Thomas, go ahead.
Just something about what you said early on, Naomi, in your presentation about the idea of feedback as an ecosystem. This is something I think about a lot as well. And I think it's right. But if it's right, one of the things about an ecosystem, and if you don't like ecosystems, then maybe we could think about the difference between arithmetic or chemical or something. But what it means to be an ecosystem is, one, it changes over time. Great. But the other thing is nothing is isolated. If you touch one thing, it impacts another thing. And this is really important in the Gen AI debate, especially about this risks area, the idea about what we want to be cautious of. Because a lot of people who are thinking about AI feedback are people who want to sell something, but also thinking about what can be replaced, what can be substituted in. And if feedback is an ecosystem, you can't just substitute something in without impacting everything else around it. So what feedback is, how it works, what it means to students. I mean, if students are going to going to AI before they're going to teachers or whatever, all of that stuff impacts the ecosystem and it all changes it. And I think that we need to be thinking about all of those different aspects together rather than thinking about any isolated thing, especially about substituting one thing out, because if it is an ecosystem, then it's not going to be that simple. Yeah, I think that's my thought.
Fantastic. Okay, so I suppose my next question is that because then you mentioned about this hybrid intelligent feedback, so that touched based on the AI human collaboration. So I think in this space, what does good practice look like when combining the human feedback and Gen AI feedback? So for example, it could be in the modules or a particular assessments. Have you implemented anything in your practice or anything you can share in that space?
No, I have not personally implemented a course or something like that, so it's hard to talk from my own experiences on this matter. But I think it really depends on how you, like the other panelists said, it's how you see feedback and what's the reason of providing these feedback. And the more that you give space for learning, I believe that the more teacher or human should play role is getting bigger. So it depends on how deep or what's the level of learning you are achieving, and that's how I basically try to define the role that you would normally give to AI or feedback. AI or human, and that's based on the level of if we, for example, touch on the Bloom's taxonomy. If you go to the higher level of learning, I believe that the role you give more space, the space you give to human should be more than AI. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Any other thoughts from other panelists?
Yeah, I'd like to add some points. Actually, we know when we talk about the AI and human collaborations, maybe we have two extremes. One is human-led, and that is the Gen AI-led. So actually, in our recent meta analysis studies on the impact of AI feedback on English writing. So we found that there's no significant differences between these two collaboration approaches, although both of them have very greater impact on learning. So we closely examined the roles of humans in such collaborations. So we found that when the students played as the feedback seeker and the reflectors, and the teachers play as the feedback interpreters and facilitators, so the effect size of such Gen AI human collaboration in the feedback practices significantly increased. So I think there may be no magic formula. How can we do this collaboration? But I think when we think of the collaborations, we need to think about what roles the humans need to play in this collaboration. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just
And
on that
I
collaboration, sorry, if you need
no,
to move on, that's just cut me off at any point in time. It's always fun. Just
Mm-mm.
on that collaboration point, this week, apropos of collaboration, I've spent most days this week running workshops at Deakin between teachers and staff, getting everybody in a room and talking about what AI feedback means and developing strategies between them. Very students as partners approach, putting everybody's voice in together. And it's been really interesting, especially people within the same class, so students who are in a specific teacher's class. One of the things we've seen a lot is students using AI feedback to question teacher feedback in terms of comments, which has been very confronting for teachers but has been a huge workload addition, but has completely changed the enthusiasm and it's completely changed the room. But it's one of those things that I think backs up this idea that once you change things, a lot of things change. And it's no good just thinking about students as recipients and saying they can get whatever we get them and we just need to give them the stuff as best as possible. Once we think about them as active participants in this, everything changes. And that has to be accommodated and thought about, I think. So when we're thinking about how to develop strategies and thinking about collaboration, making sure that students' voices are in that, I think is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, agree.
Right, fantastic. So I suppose the key word for us to take away is that, collaborative space. And I also think it is very important that we involve students in this kind of uncertain, and also it's still quite a lot we need to navigate. So a lot of students, and certainly from our projects, Flair projects, students does mention that this term called the personalization. So they think AI provide the personalized the feedback, because that might be like one-to-one, like when they prompt, they get that feedback, and sometimes the feedback they get from the lecture is so-called like a cohort based feedback. So I wonder whether you the panel have any thought on when students describe GenAI feedback as personalized, what do we really mean by that term, and who is actually doing the work of personalization? Is it the system, the students, or the educator? Any thought on this?
Got a thought on this. I think personalization is one of those words that has warped over time in its meaning, and there's a sense that we can only be doing personalized feedback if we know whose work we're looking at, that we understand their journey, almost that we're talking to them. And I don't think that's true. I believe there's huge value in cohort level feedback, not because it saves us time, although it does, but because if we can enable students to do the work of personalisation, it's going to have more of an impact because it's their processing of that information, it's their translation into personalised terms, rather than us assuming what personalised feedback looks like for them. And in our Feedback Empower Tools website, we've got a whole set of resources exactly for this, for students to take generic feedback, or we call it using feedback that isn't just for you. And there are so many examples for us as professionals as well, where there's ready feedback. It is not directed at us personally, but there's huge amounts of information in there. And if we can help people to do that work of translation and personalization, the deeper processing of that is going to have more impact. We've done a lot of studies on students' memory for feedback and what they remember. And if we rely on simple transmission, memory is very, very poor for feedback information. So we need to encourage student ownership of that process. So I think generic feedback is hugely beneficial if we can help students to use it.
Also, I think that actually I agree with that, Naomi, that the definition of personalization maybe is a little bit more at a surface level. Just simply giving it more polite and saying the name does not mean that it's personalized. That the personalized feedback goes much deeper, where it tailored to the specific needs, attitudes, and the journey of the students. And 2 years ago, we did a study to compare the feedback quality of the ChatGPT with the peer feedback. And what we found that actually the feedback from the ChatGPT stays quite at the descriptive level and does not dive into the actual problem of the task, and it's more polite, yes, but also very superficial. On the other hand, while the peers just a little bit more direct, maybe in a Dutch context it's also common to be more direct and just to the point. So it was just to the point, no descriptions of the task, no compliments, just what's the problem. And that's why in that paper also we thought that maybe a complementary role they can play considering what they are offering together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is a very kind of interesting kind of space in terms of when we think about, what and you mentioned about students also feel like the output from the generative AI is very generic. And I suppose this also links to the prompt engineering, because I think we have this phrase like garbage in, garbage out, like this kind of analogy. So I think there might be also the AI literacy that we need to support the students to develop. So I suppose I have my final questions, and then I will open the floors for the audience to ask questions. And I think Eero can also, relay some of the questions to the panel. So if institutions are serious about using Gen AI well in feedback, and I think we have been thinking in this space a lot, because universities are often under the pressures because of the workload and the increasing large student numbers and limited time. So what support do students and staff need in order to make this work? It's a bit like big questions, but I suppose we can, maybe we can come up with something, in this panel.
They might just need time and space. That might be pretty simple. I mean, if teachers don't have the time, space to think about the options and think about what's possible, then I don't know what we should be expecting from them. So that's one thing. The other thing, oh no, I'll pass on from that point.
I think there's a really important need for us to reassure people of their value. We've just finishing a university-wide assessment redesign in light of generative AI. So we've supported the redesign of over 4,000 pieces of assessment. And when we haven't returned to in-person exams, we're assuming students are using AI. So we've redesigned assessments around this idea of assessing process, not product. And when I've been working with staff on this, I've often felt like people think I personally invented generative AI and it was my fault. And I've also felt like one of the men in the basement in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang who's being tortured because they can't invent a flying car, and I can't give people a really foolproof assessment design. But what I've noticed and what I've really reflected on in these sessions is that people feel under existential threat. Teachers are feeling, what is my role going to be in a future with AI? So I think if we want this to work, we need to make sure we are reassuring people and reiterating the fact that humans are essential to education, and they always will be, at least if we can try and curate the form of education that we think really matters.
So here I would like add in. So follow up Naomi's points. Actually, I don't know whether in UK you have such kind of experience. So in Hong Kong, so we actually have this GenAI policy, but it's always vague, and also we can see actually the responsibilities migrates downwards from institution to department, and from department to individual teachers. So actually, this individualizing the challenges without resolving it. So the teachers are vulnerable. So they are afraid of making consequential decisions without clear policy guidance. And of course, sometimes this fear is sometimes related to their specific feedback literacy in the generic context. So therefore, they need training and good practice examples for reference. Yeah.
Yeah, I hesitate to talk more about other things that I've written that weren't feedback, but the wicked problems idea I think is valuable for another reason, which is that it points out, or it makes clear or reminds us that teachers are dealing with students right now, and there are people who are putting pressure on them from below, but there's also students who they take responsibility for. And it's also, I mean, teaching's always had a huge moral responsibility that goes along with it. But we know that we're dealing with things that we're not sure about, and we're not sure what the right thing to do is. And one of the things about a wicked problem is that there is no correct, there's no silver bullet out there. There's no thing that's going to be the perfect solution. There might be better and worse ones, but to figure out what the better and worse ones are, we need to try, we need to think, we need to work together, and it's not going to be immediate. So the pressure that comes along with that is massive, because we know that students are in our class looking for solutions. We know that they're looking for answers. We know that the other units that they're in are telling them different information, and that's hard for them and it's hard for us. and getting the support and understanding that's going along with that, and what it means to be a teacher in all of this, changing constantly, I think is very difficult. And finding the space to change, to think about these things, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I think we can open the questions to, yeah, Jeffrey. Probably need the microphone.
I think I'm probably speaking for the whole room when I say this has been a fascinating panel, so thank you, everybody. One of the things we've been talking about is what kinds of feedback students like. So do they like AI feedback? Do they like feedback from a tutor? We're not really talking about whether they learn anything. So irrespective of what kind of feedback they like, does feedback help students learn? And it seems like an obvious question, but it's not one we're asking. And in all our thinking about feedback, can we link students' preference for this or that kind of feedback to actually any impact on their learning? And I do think we need to think about this because particularly in higher education, I don't think there's very much research, in fact, on the effect that feedback has. There's quite a lot of work on school-age children, particularly in mathematics teaching. I wonder sometimes we're putting a lot of time and energy into something that we're doing without asking why we're doing it. And in my more provocative moments, I say, feedback's a waste of time, we should stop doing it. But, you know, we don't have to go that far, but I think we should still ask whether students' preference for AI feedback or tutor feedback actually makes a difference to their learning in the end.
Anybody would like to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I can start saying something. I think for me personally, I think if there is no learning point in feedback, I don't define it as feedback. So the whole purpose of feedback is that we try to teach, to see as a learning, feedback for learning. And the point is that to see if students are doing something wrong, we explain them why are they wrong and what is wrong and how is the right way to do that. So there should be definitely a learning point in that. And if we are also considering the preference of the students, and that's because we want them to take it serious. We want them to implement it, because even the best feedback is not implemented, it's useless. So the purpose of personalizations, either from a more affective perspective or from a cognitive perspective, is to maximize the uptake level of the feedback. And the other questions about whether it's coming from AI or teacher or peers, the perceived usefulness definitely is something that it's important to maybe for students to see whether this is a value of for their learning or not. But the other thing, I had also a discussion with some of the audiences here, that when students feel like the teacher did not do anything to provide this feedback, they feel that they are like left alone with AI, and they don't like it. Like if they pay 80,000 euros in a year and they just get feedback from AI, even though it's valuable, they say, so why am I coming here? So I think even though the fact that its perceived usefulness might be high, but it's still not coming from the fact that they don't feel like it's been acknowledged, it's been processed by the teachers to be given. That's something maybe impact their uptake. Yeah.
I completely agree with you that that question of learning is fundamental, and there is a large literature on this. I think maybe the challenge is it's more heavily situated in my field of educational psychology than it is and cognitive science than it is in mainstream educational research. But that question of preferences versus impact, I think, is a really, really important one. And I'll give you a very, very simple example. The feedback sandwich. I mean, how many of us were told to use the feedback sandwich in training? I certainly was. This idea that you take your piece of criticism and you sandwich it in between two pieces of praise to make it more palatable. And students say this feels nice because they get that little bit of praise and it kind of softens the blow of the criticism. We've been doing multiple studies, some of them lab-based, some of them based with sort of real assignments on what impact the feedback sandwich does. And in short, it does harm to students. It causes an anchoring effect where students see that first piece of praise, it anchors their mindset in the praise and it influences how well they process the arguably more important critique that follows. So students who are being given feedback in the sandwich style end up making less improvement on subsequent tasks than students who aren't given feedback in the sandwich style. So there's some really important work that I think we need to do more of it, and maybe bring it into more of the mainstream educational field. But that question of what students like versus what actually has more impact is really, really important.
Sorry, that's
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. That was really interesting. I have a question for Naomi, but it actually kind of perhaps maps onto what other people are saying. I completely agree with you. Feedback is a process, right? But I'm wondering though if one of the statements you had up there about that feedback is a process, not corrective comments, if that oversimplifies things a little bit, because I understand you, because like you, I read a lot of educational literature and I'm in educational research, but I'm thinking to myself here, I'm thinking, how would that translate across to some of my colleagues when they hear that? So I'm thinking of my colleagues in, like, for example, biological sciences who are teaching undergraduate medics. So at my university, students are writing about 2 essays every single week on questions, and the exercises, they have to see the complexity of the question, they have to draw concepts together and try to, establish argumentation and analysis and evaluation, right? But in that process, they inevitably make mistakes. They misinterpret something or misunderstand a complex process or something like that. And then, no, I'm thinking of those colleagues and they're going to think, are you telling me I should not correct that student? But beyond that, not only do they correct that student, but actually in the process of the correction, that actually builds trust with the student. Because they're seeing, what the student is seeing is like, I've written this essay and I've made a mistake. Now the student might think, oh my God, I've made a mistake and an academic in the field has to correct me. But actually, when the academic just corrects the misunderstanding, but then focuses on the higher order things of argumentation and evaluation, how the student drew the concepts together, that then helps the student see what's important. It signals and models to the student what's important. And so in a sense, I'm reading this, so I completely understand what you mean, but I'm just wondering, people who aren't embedded in educational literature, how they might look at that and think, oh, actually in my actual practice, correcting students is part of the process, and it's part of an educational obligation to some degree, and it helps prioritize it's perfectly fine to have a misunderstanding of a complex thing, but what's actually important is the higher order learning. So in that way, when a student is also then seeing that kind of feedback from an expert in the field, that's something that GenAI can't do, in a sense. That's another kind of human element. That's what I meant when this speaks more broadly. I just wondering if you could speak to that.
I can, and this if ever you're in a room with people like David Carlis, David Bowd, people who've been working on feedback for decades, anybody starts this conversation about is feedback a product or a process, it opens up arguments and it can go on for literally hours. So I understand what you're saying, that yes, we conceptualize feedback as a process. Comments are still important. They are the fundamental driver of that process. So we still have to have those. The problem comes when a comment or a correction is left on its own to do all the weight of feedback. And then we go, okay, feedback's happened because I've written some comments or I've corrected a paper, without actually knowing what happens next. Has anything changed? Has that student's conceptual understanding changed in a way that means next time they're faced with a similar problem, they would transfer that understanding of that correction to something else? So it's about what happens next. Yes, we need to correct misunderstanding. It's really, really important. But if we assume that means feedback has happened, we're making quite a critical assumption that may not be founded. That's the challenge. So it's about when we discharge our responsibility, and if we say we've given corrective comments, therefore feedback has happened, we don't know. It might have done, but it might not. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that one.
Fantastic. I'm mindful of the time because we are approaching the end of this keynote panel. I want to ask Iro, do you have any?
Several. Do we have time?
Yes, just one more question and then we'll finish off.
So I think most of the questions that are on the Mentimeter you kind of touched on during your presentation, but there's one that I think is a little bit more qualitative that you might have some comments on. So how would you say you would balance the voice of students who want personal human feedback and are against the use of AI, and the need to reduce academic workload while improving support? Sorry.
It's a very good question. We had actually this discussion as well. I'm a part of an AI Central group at the university, and we had this discussion, what if students don't want feedback from AI and they're against this? Honestly, there is no like a clear guideline to say how to deal with, but I think it has to be acknowledged, in my opinion. It has to be acknowledged, and yeah, it has to be acknowledged, and just to be given human feedback has to be given. If there are some other thoughts, please.
Just very quickly say something about workload and efficiency, and I think this is really important because generative AI has come at a time when in the UK and elsewhere questions of resource and efficiency and workload have never been more prominent. So it's like this perfect storm, isn't it, that we're managing these challenges, and then something comes along that looks like it could do some of the work for us. A lot of that, I think, is a false economy, and I think that's the thing to remember with efficiency and workload. What are we losing? Are we actually saving, or are we just redistributing time? And I would argue instead that rather than seeing generative AI as the solution to the workload challenge, to actually think about, is there something we should be doing fundamentally different in feedback to start with? And that probably means us doing less and students doing more, not because we want to outsource our work to them, but because we know it's going to have more impact for them in the longer term.
Fantastic. So I would like to thank all our speakers again for their wonderful and thought-provoking presentations, and I'm sure we have a lot to think about, to take away, and also continue discussing throughout the day and beyond. So thank you so much, Naomi, Kazem, Jen, and Thomas. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Okay, so now we will have a refreshment break.